on the bottom of your screen, although I'm sure you're all professionals by now in Zoom meetings, that there is a question and answer sort of button. Please use that for questions and answers, but there's also a chat function. And in the chat function, we would really appreciate if you engage in sending us resources or other ideas or questions and engaging the group. So with that, let me welcome everyone again. You are on mute, so the only way of communicating with us is through the chat or the Q&A. The views here are our own and not those of our institutions or the US Food and Drug Administration. And this is the series that we have planned. We're going today to talk about community awareness, access, and knowledge. We will go on in 2 weeks to talk about workforce development, and then study design, eligibility, site selection, and feasibility, study conduct, including recruitment and retention issues, then data standards and analysis, stakeholder roles and responsibilities, and the role of data in diversity, genetics, real-world data. We will probably continue this series going forward with a planned one on IRB and human research protections and its role in diversity in clinical trials, and then continue as we identify additional areas to cover. As you'll see, these are about every 2 weeks with a vacation over the holidays, but otherwise we invite you to join and look forward to your active participation as we proceed. So today I'm delighted to say that after a short introduction of the diversity document that we've been working on, I'm delighted to welcome Tisha Johnson, the Associate Director for Clinical Research at the Yale School of Medicine and the Deputy Director and Chief Operating Officer of Yale Center for Clinical Investigation, and followed by Jessica Scott, who's the Head of Research and Development Patient Engagement Office at Takeda Pharmaceutical Company, to give us real practical examples and sort of the lived experience of doing this work and doing this work well. So today I'm going to start with a short introduction to the MRCT Center, then to the project that we've been working on, Achieving Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity in Clinical Research, spend some time talking about the work we've produced and made available in the guidance and toolkit, and then we'll proceed to Tisha and Jessica. So the MRCT Center is a research and policy center at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard that really is dedicated to improving the integrity, safety, and rigor of clinical trials with a particular focus on multi-site, multinational, global clinical trials. And we do that work by identifying emerging issues and then aggregating a group of really diverse stakeholders to define those issues and then to create ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. And we believe that by bringing everyone together around the table, the solutions that we propose are probably going to be really more readily accepted and implementable. For that reason, it's important that everybody be at the table. Now, I don't have to remind everyone today of the importance of diversity in clinical trials and inclusion in clinical trials. All we have to do, although this is a long-standing problem, the lack of diversity in clinical research, when we look at the health disparities by race and ethnicity in the current pandemic, it is chilling to see that compared to white individual and adjusted for age, race and ethnicity widens the gap in terms of the proportion of individuals that are affected by the disease. We don't know really why that's true. We don't know whether it's social determinants of health. We don't know whether it's, because people are living in multi-generational families and taking transportation, whether that's comorbidities, whether there are other factors that sort of weigh into this, but we do know that this is highly disproportionate. And this is not new news. but it has certainly brought it home to us here. And I should say that that is compounded by the fact that race and ethnicity, diverse populations are underrepresented in research. So as we develop therapeutics for this pandemic, as for many other diseases, we're not representing the affected population in the research that we do. Approximately 2.5 years ago, knowing that this was a long-standing and unsolved problem of underserved in research, we coordinated a work group to work on this problem. And over the last 2.5 years, first following the work of a bioethics collaborative, we've generated a rather comprehensive document, which we've made available in August this year. And it's divided into 2 parts. It's diversity, inclusion, and equity in clinical research, the guidance, and then a toolkit that appends the guidance document itself, which really speaks to some of the tools that are not easily available elsewhere. The group itself was led by a number of people at the Mrct Center, as well as the FDA, representatives of industry and academia, but had the real involvement of over 50 people, and more at times representing patients, patient advocates, academia, pharmaceutical companies, CROs, organizations, both nonprofit, trade, government agencies, research institutes, and others. And it was really a really wonderful experience and a learning experience for all of us to sit together weekly, often more often, and work through these issues. That document itself is together about 500 pages, so it's a little bit dense, even though it's a brilliant read and fun to work through. It is a dense piece, and therefore we're leading in series to dissect some of the issues in greater detail. But it does take a multi-stakeholder consensus view. It tries to represent each of the different organizations, how they can participate in understanding the problem and practical solutions, as it were, to addressing it and making iterative improvements. There is a series of recommendations for each of the accountable organization, and we really speak to how change can occur. And the toolkit, as I mentioned, provides practical and adaptable resources that weren't found easily elsewhere. Where they were, we left that to others. So this is the overall document. As you can see, we build the case, thinking through how to think about diversity inclusion in both a biological and a health disparity context, thinking about the entire product life cycle from identifying a target and a disease through the clinical trial development period to pharmacovigilance and real-world data. Obviously, this is more than just making changes around the edges in clinical trials, but it starts and is important to understand that it starts with the patient and ends with the patient. And while we can do many things for this, we need to remember that at the beginning and end, a patient and an individual is both at risk and hopefully able to benefit. We talk about several undergirding issues like workforce development, which we'll talk about, cultural competencies, financial resources that need to be thought through, infrastructure and accountability. And the numbers here are the chapters that we address these issues in each of the chapters of the guidance. And today we're going to be talking about access, recruitment, and screening, really trying to think about how do we pull and involve the patient community and participant groups together to participate in a real way in this work. So awareness is understanding the research, that research exists for general and specific conditions or medical situations. Access is extending clinical trials and research studies to the individual and community. Of course, they need to be aware of the existence of clinical research and of trials before they can access those or have those presented to them. And then knowledge so that they are empowered to decide in a value concordant way whether they wish to enter a trial, and make sure that they understand the purpose, applicability, and utility of the research, and choose whether or not to participate. But it is true that individuals cannot participate unless they're asked to join a trial. And in studies that have done at least that have been done at least in oncology, the rate at which individuals that are Black and Latinx join a trial is the same as white participants, which seems to mean that that they're not asked because they're underrepresented in research. So our key here is to talk through patient and community engagement and how that supports diverse participation in trials. And there are several aspects to that. First, to form relationships, to ensure that the patient and community are in key leadership roles as advisors, as consultants, and as respected participants and partners in the process of trials, whether they're academic or industry sponsored. I think that there is certain training and support for patient perspectives so that they can feel empowered and competent to influence research priorities and questions, and approach this with the lived experience that they have about what is important to them, what research outcomes are of importance, what conduct and barriers they should think through, and how to improve the way that we conduct and approach clinical trials. And that there are shared goals, that patient partners and the public are engaged to tailor the study design and conduct, and that itself will improve access, enrollment, and retention. It's important that these are sustained partnerships, as you'll hear about from Tisha Johnson later. It is important to us that if one cannot make a secure and prolonged commitment to the community, that one finds trusted intermediaries to do so. One doesn't want to fly in and sort of take what one wants or needs in a true engagement paradigm, but rather make sure that that's a partnership, and setting up these activities so that they're seen as partners and not by convenience or by necessity. We start with listening, we end with listening, and that's an important piece of community collaboration. So how to do that? We go through a number of engagement strategies, engaging minority healthcare physicians and staff. And in addition to the care providers that we suggest, we think through how to maintain that, establish and then maintain those relationships. We also have to think about working with minority PIs and study staff in the community, attending community events, establishing a presence at community centers and clinics, offering free health screenings, whatever one can do to understand the needs and wants of a community, and also to use those opportunities to impart knowledge about clinical trials and clinical research. We have in the toolkit a number of resources that we hope you will use and engage with us to improve them. Certainly there's a checklist to think through how to build these relationships and then to address priorities for the public and for the communities, which of course is not a unidimensional community. It is informed and nuanced by the kind of community, what the disease, the population, etc. Study design, conduct, and dissemination. We think it's important that what we do in terms of informed consent and patient study materials and research procedures, as well as the return of results, is done in a health literate way, in a language that is understandable to the participant, their family, and the public, and that we do really take seriously the responsibility that if a person has participated in a clinical trial, and if the community has supported their participation, that we return the results not only to the participant, but to the community. And that should be in a way that is relevant to the intended population itself. We also talk about different ways of initiating community engagement. A model checklist, it's not in any way definitive, but rather it is meant to provoke your thinking and adapt to your specific needs. Thinking about building community and local partnerships, either yourself or through these trusted intermediaries, finding and training community members as staff, creating community advisory boards, attending events, and reaching out to religious, local institution, and other leaders. There are advertising strategies. It's important to think about the channel of advertising for clinical trials that are appropriate to the specific communities and how they prefer and want to receive information. And then how to think about integrating research into everyday life, how to decrease the burden of those trials by decentralizing the trials, doing what one can and closer to home, and thinking about providing necessary resources for the individuals so that they can continue to participate. Similarly, one needs to think about how to support the community involvement itself. How do we make sure that we are giving as much as we are receiving? So we end with a series of recommendations for stakeholders to establish that community presence and understand it, to commit to long-term partnerships that are true partnerships with trusted organizations, to sustain that connectivity with the community. We want to appreciate the value and significance of community insight, and understand the specific communities that, whether that's by condition, by language, by culture, or by location. We need to develop educational programs and resources to support research literacy and address knowledge and awareness, and find and educate community members broadly on clinical research and for specific trials. Prior to their being asked to participate in a trial itself, people need to understand why we do research and sort of feel emboldened to ask questions. In order to do that, we believe that we need to understand what questions the community itself has, not impart to the community those things that we think they should know, but rather find out from them what things they wish to know. It's important to think about having dedicated recruitment coordinators that are able to travel to public locations and meet the patients where they are, and to consider bringing back to us in academic or to the industry issues that are they uncover in those communities. I think it's important to make sure that the financial needs of the community partner are addressed, and the participant in terms of their expenses for participation as well. And those should be addressed in grant funding and budgets as needed. And really the community is bi-directional. While sponsors, investigators, and research coordinators should not simply visit a community and ask, but rather expect to be responsive and potentially give them of themselves in return. And similarly for patients, community organizations, and the public, you know, the goal here is to really help patients and potential participants in the public become aware of clinical research, to make sure that that clinical research itself is responsive to the needs and goals of the community, that it's understandable, and to impart some understanding that the current lack of diversity in clinical trials limits our clinical decision making. If patients are not, or like us, are not in clinical trials, then we have no data as to how these drugs or devices will work for us. And this limits the ability and our clinicians' ability to make decisions. We hope that we increase the involvement of patient advocacy organizations in promoting diverse inclusion of participants in clinical research and providing awareness materials for the public regarding the benefit of clinical research. And the patient advocacy organizations themselves attend to becoming and thinking about diverse inclusion of the advocacy organizations themselves. This is only partially touching on the many things that we review and explain, but we thought that today it would be helpful to have some practical examples of how this work has been done and the work done well. And then I hope that we'll have time for discussion and questions and responding to your suggestions at the end of the talk. And with that, I do want to say that we're mindful that what you cannot measure, you cannot change, and you cannot improve. So we propose for each of the organizations and for each of the issues a series of metrics that we really want you to consider, adapt, extend, so that we can figure out what works, what doesn't work, and how to make changes over time. So here are some, and of course this is just meant as a guide for you to think through and develop your own that are responsive to your needs and directions and how you think about the work. But we also appreciate that progress will take time. If we don't start, we won't make changes, and therefore we really think we need to start, and we need to start now together. And with that, let me introduce Tisha, who will talk to us about the work she's done and led at the Yale Center for Clinical Investigation and Yale School of Medicine. Thank you, Tisha. Now I have to end show and let you be the presenter. Do I do that? How do I do that? I'm not out of this. Are you able to be the presenter yet?
Not yet. You're still sharing.
Okay. How do I get out of sharing? See, we didn't practice everything. Yesterday it worked. Sorry, everyone. Here we are. There you go. You should be able to share now.
I should be. Here we go.
You are.
Yep,
Are you
we
guys?
see you.
We see.
Yeah.
Okay, let me minimize my friends. Thank you so much, Barbara. I am delighted to be here and to talk to you about our experience at Yale and what we've been doing. And this is just always, I think, when we hear presentations, we are comparing ourselves to know kind of whether our environments are similar when we think about implementation strategies. So we're a large multi-hospital health system. Our electronic health record is a part of our clinical footprint. This is kind of our general stat. So if you're trying to figure out if you look like us, this is just information to help you. I don't want to spend time going through it. I really want to talk about this really important issue. And the way we've chosen to think about diversity in clinical trials and research participation is really this integrated approach to recruitment and our strategies, representing not only the leadership within our health system, our physicians, our patients, our clinical trials participants, but also our community leaders. And so that's been a very effective strategy for us, and I'll show you some of the outcomes in just a few minutes. But a really big piece of how we've done this is to really leverage our electronic health record. And our community leaders have been a huge part of that. We've modified our patient portal to include a research tab, which lists our available clinical trials. It allows our patients to build their own profile, to manage what research they would like to hear about. We've also included in this era of COVID, a COVID sign up. And so literally before we began our first vaccine study, we were waiting for activation on that. We had over 300 individuals go in, complete a profile and say, as soon as the study opens, I will be ready to participate. Shortly after opening, we wanted to make sure that we had diverse representation and inclusion. And so we actually sent out a MyChart message to make sure that people had seen not just this sort of passive ability to sign up for COVID studies, but an active link to our underrepresented patients across our health system. And within the first few hours, we had another 100 all minority participants who had clicked into the link. 50 of them had already gone into Open Scheduler and scheduled an appointment. And so I think this is really showing us that what Barbara said in the earlier comments are right, that if participants are asked, that there isn't really a hesitancy about considering of clinical trials. It's really, are we asking the question? One of the other things that I think that we've really looked at related to this effort has been when our underrepresented participants choose to take a look at messages that are sent, choose to browse the clinical trials and build profiles. And 60% of all of our participants from underrepresented populations, actually, 67%, are coming in after hours and on weekends. Many of them, the vast majority, between midnight and 4 a.m. And so I think for us, this is really proven that it's about providing the access in a way that makes sense for the community. I'd say the most important element, however, of our entire program is our cultural ambassadors for research. It's a partnership with the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. You see two of our wonderful reverends here, Reverend Perry and Reverend Clayton, and a partnership with a community-based organization, advocacy organization focused on Hispanic and Latinx, Latino issues called Junta for Progressive Action. And this bi-directional partnership started over 10 years ago. Our community leaders help us set priorities. They actually identify the ambassadors that are partnered with us and at the table. The original ambassadors who started with us over 10 years ago have well over 200 hours of dedicated clinical research training in study design, in understanding the informed consent requirements. Even we have training sessions on clinicaltrials.gov. But then they help us really think about what are the research priorities, what are the focus areas we want to work on, how do we have recruitment strategies and plans and protocols that are reflective of their needs, and really consider all of the issues that they face as individuals in the community, and also translate it appropriately. And so we meet with our researchers at least monthly. Lately in COVID, I think we've been meeting almost weekly, but this group has just been incredibly engaged in helping us really transform the way we do clinical research at Yale. And the results of this has been incredible, not just with the growth of participants from underrepresented populations. When we started this program 10 years ago, we were horrible. To be honest, most of our studies, if we were lucky, had 2 or 4% participation of minority populations in our clinical trials, and that was with an incredible concerted effort by the physician, or so they thought, or the research leads. Where we are today is in FY20, we had more than 30%. We were actually on track. We thought we were going to set a new record. We were looking at around 35%. And then we started to see some of the impact of the issues we're all facing now. But we have more than 30% of our total participation is from underrepresented populations. And this is also with a 10-fold increase in total accrual in clinical trials over the same time period. We are seeing over the past 2 years between 8 and 10% of our new patients coming into our health system coming to seek research participation. And you can see here, this is kind of the way our health system looks. I showed a map earlier, but you can see our church partners, you can see our clinical sites, you can see Junta, our hospital sites. We really see ourselves as this integrated environment. And more importantly, the community sees us as this integrated environment, and access to clinical trials and participation in clinical trials in this disease agnostic, patient-centric way, they see as an important access issue in helping us address diversity in clinical trials. And so we're really proud of where we are. It's also led us to a wonderful partnership with the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity at the FDA. We've signed an MOU, and we have some really exciting opportunities. We've had some conferences. We are focused on diversity within the healthcare space, within the workforce. But as the primary goal of the partnership, it's really to focus on expanding this premise that community engagement in this way can change diverse participation. It can change community attitudes, patient attitudes towards clinical trials participation if you address issues of trust, you address issues of access, and you make sure that the voices that are presenting this material or partnering in the presentation of this material are trusted in the community. So this is, as Barbara said, we were really thrilled to be one of the examples in the document that was put forth by the center, and a little bit more information is there. I wanted to just give you a flavor of what we're doing at our center today, and I'll hand over the controls now to my colleague Jessica, who's going to give you an example and speak about this concept from industry, and hopefully we'll have time for questions a little later. Thank you again, Barbara, and thank you everyone for participating. I think that, as Barbara said earlier, it really will take all of us working together to think about how we're going to address diverse participation in clinical trials. Thank you.
Thanks, Taisha. Yeah, what a powerful example of community engagement, and appreciate your sharing the details. I think it really fits very well with what we're seeing as well on the industry side. And so I want to speak to my perspective and what we're doing at Takeda. From a personal perspective, the patient experience is actually one that's really near and dear to my heart. Starting in my formative years with my sister being diagnosed with bone cancer, and she passed during her teenage years and my teenage years as well. And that led to my desire to go to medical school. Not to cure cancer, but really out of a deep sense of wanting to care for people, for their families, through the onset of illness, and as whole people and as whole families, and even as communities. And when I got to medical school, I was exposed to, here actually in Boston at Tufts, the idea of family medicine, and it's based on the biopsychosocial model of caring for patients. So as I developed in my career subsequently as a family physician for over a decade, there was much economic shift in healthcare, and I felt like we were not able to fully address the whole person and the whole community in a short, 10-minute office visit. And for me, this meant that I wasn't able to be the kind of doctor I wanted to be. It led to my interest in having a broader impact on helping to address a broken system at a policy level. I realized in then law school, which I attended in order to be able to move to that broader policy level, that I have a real passion for collaboration and innovation on complex issues, which is what brings us here today. So next slide. So for me, a career step in my journey was initially at another pharmaceutical company where I really learned the broader healthcare and pharmaceutical ecosystem and the policy perspective, and understood kind of where my passion was, which brought me to Takeda. Because of Takeda's history as a very old company, over 230 years, we have a long history for focusing first on the needs and interests of patients, and then developing trust and reputation and business follow. So in that order, based on our corporate priorities, I saw the foundation for what we could do at Takeda as being unique and different. And that really stimulated my interest and brought me to Takeda. Next slide. So what are we doing what does this mean from a practical perspective? Next slide. We were able to develop a very robust structure for engaging with patients and partnering in patients across R&D in a very innovative program for a progressive KPI evolution, which you can see here is really starting in 2018, where we started to really introduce the greater connectivity with the patient experience for all R&D employees. And then from there in 2019, we expanded to require that 100% of all in-scope global program teams develop a patient engagement activity, and began to progress in more of a proactive manner from there to 100% of all global program teams that are in scope. This year, we'll have a proactive roadmap or a patient engagement plan. And that's a way to really think forward how we'll engage with patients and the patient community with a lot of forethought, because as Barbara was saying, and Tisha as well, it's not about a short, quick interaction with patients and the patient community. It's a sustained commitment that we need to demonstrate through our actions. And this really allows us to partner with patients in a completely different way, and allows us to get some of the issues addressed through this partnership with patients that Barbara highlighted earlier. It's about priority setting, understanding the relevant and meaningful endpoints for patients and patient communities. It's also about study design and how we can incorporate the needs of patients and more diverse patients into the design of studies, understanding what patients need in terms of support, transportation, access if they're in rural communities, et cetera, et cetera. And we need to also nurture these relationships and share back, which is something Barbara also addressed. So go to the next slide. The fundamental piece here about patient engagement and diversity is that both require the same sort of skill set. Both require us to listen deeply with an open mind to discover what we don't know, rather than just confirming what we suspected. And typically as scientists, we think about a hypothesis and then we seek to validate it or negate it. And in engaging with patients, and in understanding the needs of diverse patient populations, we need to keep an open mind to discover what we don't even know we don't know. And this requires humility and empathy. And the benefit is that through deep listening, we learn about perspectives other than our own, and we can incorporate these perspectives in new ways that we wouldn't have understood but for the engagement. In this way, we really are partnering, and it's critical for our mutual success in order that we bring new medicines of value to those in need. So the deep listening at Takeda is through two-way dialogue, where our internal teams are sitting at the table virtually at this point in time to hear directly from patients, to understand their perspectives, to really think and question, ask clarifying questions, open-ended questions, And this shows respect, it affirms dignity, it encourages people to share what's truly important to them. And in that way, we're setting ourselves up for getting the information that we really need. And this is true of communities as well. So next slide. Health equity issues lead to diversity in clinical trial issues. And if we can address the root cause, we can help communities and individuals. More patients in trials, not just a one-off problem where it's a recruitment issue, that's a standalone issue. This is about addressing underlying issues with inequities. The solution is really about strengthening the communities and including building capacity that can help the community with healthcare delivery in that community. And let me give you an example here. We've partnered with NGO communities in places like Africa, where what we're bringing to the community is based on the needs of that community to, for example, have laboratory or pathology testing. A community that needs help with cancer detection, that we are able to build capacity and the skills needed to run a PCR machine, for example, is a long-term commitment to the community that in one particular case helped with the current COVID pandemic, so that now that community is able to run tests for COVID-19 because of the capacity that was built. In another way, deep listening and partnership in communities can help us understand how best to implement an approach or new technologies. So another example in Africa, where we developed a nodal approach to running a clinical trial, because we understood from the community that what they needed was to have patients from more remote areas come to a community center so that they could have a touch point with that individual. Individuals may not have smartphones, they may have to pay extra for internet connection, and they also have a touch point where they can see if there's also food scarcity issues, food insecurity, there's privacy issues. Like it's hard for us to even imagine in a third world country, but so many individuals live with families in a one-room home. They don't have privacy to be able to speak about their healthcare issues from a home. And they have concerns about privacy. And this is something that we can address through our engagement to understand the particular needs of a certain community. So next slide. The upshot here really is about our ability to partner in a way that builds trust, that delivers access, as Tisha and Barbara also mentioned. And we do this through deep understanding, through deep dialogue and communication as the route to both patient engagement and diversity within individual patient and community engagements. Think carefully about how you engage with the community, how it might seem to them to have a single touch point versus a longer term commitment. And help to realize that culture change takes time, that we need to demonstrate touchworthiness, and it's critical to our mutual success in order to bring new medicines and vaccines to those in need. So Barbara, I'll turn it back to you for some question and answer time.
And thank you both very much for sharing your experiences. We've had a number of questions come in, both in the Q&A and in the chat box. Let me invite anyone to share questions, and also, of course, any examples or resources or things you'd like us to be aware of. But let me start with this. So one of the things you talked about, Tisha, was the COVID-19 pandemic and how many people have volunteered. But as we think generally about community engagement, it does seem like having that personal touch is so important. And we often envision this as a human-to-human interaction, given the challenges with social distancing now. How have you addressed that? How have you learned to continue that engagement despite the limitations on being together?
It's interesting. One of the things that we've talked about is we are so lucky to have really launched this partnership 10 years ago and really had the trust of the community, because it made it so much easier to pivot during COVID, because as you said, we couldn't imagine not having this face-to-face kinds of interaction. And in many ways, the remote has forced us to be more creative, more innovative in reaching all of the populations. One of the most exciting things that I'll share with the community, we had a town hall format, which is our typical town format for many of our meetings. But specifically, we're beginning a study, engaging in a study in which consent will be waived. And so a clear FDA requirement there is broad community awareness so that individuals can opt out. And we've done that through advertisement in the past, through these town halls in individual churches and so on. And our partners came up with a really cool idea. They enlisted a local radio show host who had a following. He helped us to launch a radio Facebook Live event in which our investigator presented the material. Our IRB and our HRPP leadership was a part of the presentation with our ambassadors, and we had over 460 individuals join us, which is larger than any of the town halls we've had in the history of these kind of activities. And so it's forced us to be really creative, and we have had to address things for some of the churches and the communities, like helping them to provide inexpensive iPads to not only promote the connections that they want to continue related to research awareness, but also to help with access to healthcare, like MyChart and video visits and other things. And so we really had to pivot and I think be more creative than we've had to think about in the past, but it's helped us, I think, to strengthen those bonds that we have with our community leaders. At the beginning of COVID, they pivoted and asked us to help with trusted sources of information, and that's what we did. And so we had meetings with them generally about twice a week, where our clinical leaders, our research leaders, our informatics leaders were presenting to them, explaining to them who was in the hospital, what's the breakdown of the demographics, discussing the latest knowledge that we had gathered around COVID clinically, and also what research we had initiated to begin to address it. So I think that having these partnerships, as you and Jessica have both stated, that you need to establish the relationships, and then it's easy to weather, as we're finding a pandemic, with those partnerships intact and in place, with equal partners at the table helping us to address the needs that are important to the community. So it's been great for us in terms of understanding more with the community and how to help them technically, and I think has led us to new ways of doing things that will continue post-pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you. And let me ask Jessica the same, given that you're, the beauty of what Tisha's described is this longstanding partnership that's committed, that's there. How have you approached this, and how have you thought about establishing new partnerships, particularly in the US?
Yeah. I think what we're touching on here is that we're better together. So there are opportunities that COVID is presenting as kind of a silver lining that we can really build on, and through my approach through bringing that patient perspective into how we move forward is critical. The one opportunity is by having more virtual patient engagement activities, we are getting more diverse perspectives in the ad boards rather than the in-person where it may be difficult for some to travel. And this is an opportunity for us to design trials differently and to respond to the necessities of COVID-19 with more virtualized clinical trials, more home health and telehealth, more EPROs. And for the most part, that's building on what we've already heard from patients, that they would want to decrease the burden of participating in the trial and increase our diversity in the trials themselves. But we also are hearing in a patient panel for COVID-19 specifically that we've had recently, that it's not a one size fits all. And there's a tremendous need for flexibility because one individual, for example, who may have young children at home, they may want someone to come draw blood in the home so they don't have to get someone to watch their children, as a way to help decrease the requirements of a trial for them, whereas someone else who has elderly or infirm family members may rather go to a local lab. So as we move forward to navigate this space, we really, and think about how to bring in more diverse patients into our clinical trials, we really need to engage with those, with individuals from those populations to understand how best to move forward and check that we're heading in the right direction.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, it's come up on a number of the issues in the chat box. How do we do this? How do we initiate in the time of COVID? And, you know, I have to say that I don't want to discount in any way the value not only of partnering with the community, but with the trusted community partners that we can access. So if we're sitting on the side of industry or academia, there are patient advocacy groups, there are community organizations, there are organizations like Tisha's that already has the outreach built in. There are hospital community centers that live and breathe in the community. Those are the people we should be working with. They're there for the duration. They're not there for, you know, one myeloma trial or one hypertension trial or one vaccine that needs to, you know, recruit additional populations. And, you know, the other thing I'll say, where we're now involved in you know, a testing and later vaccine initiative in the community in Boston, and that any one community is many micro communities. And you really have to appreciate that when we have Zoom calls, for instance, and we've just been investigating this, how do you translate into a language that's appropriate for many individuals if it's not English? Do you have a translator? Well, it turns out you can buy a translator on Zoom, you know, and you know, so thinking creatively and then asking people that are really part of this and do this, as it were, for a living, not creating drugs and not delivering healthcare, but living and breathing in a way that is respectful and appreciates where people are coming from rather than making them come to, quote, to us, is essential. So I think in answer to some of the chat questions, we're learning as you are, but we're also committed to learning with flexibility and investment and sort of figuring out how people get information. And let me just say that in our experience in a limited way now, you know, the folks that the Black public communities, or that doesn't sound right, the Black communities that we're engaged with get information is different than Russian immigrants, is different than Latinx immigrants, and different than Latinx populations here. We need to learn this, and that's why we're doing this work together to figure out what works and what doesn't work, and then to move on. So I think that it's really interesting. But let me ask Jessica, you spoke about capacity building in low and middle income countries. How might that link to increasing diverse representation in your clinical trials?
Yeah. It's a long-term investment in the community. With the example that I gave on the pathology lab, there wasn't any direct intent to run a trial in that community at that point in time. Of course, you know, as we move forward, detecting cancer will ultimately lead to more treatment for cancer, but that's a win-win. And
Right.
so, starting with what do you need is really, I think, the baseline point. And we can't do that everywhere, but to the extent that we can do as much of that as possible, depending on the needs of the community, I think that we're heading in a direction that helps build the relationship, and that's where we need to begin in many of these communities where we've got to start, really far upstream.
And certainly not restricted to low and middle income countries.
Exactly, that's true. And one point actually that you just made, Barbara, it just reminded me of a quote that I had pulled out of the guidance. Access, however, extends beyond physical and structural considerations into psychosocial and interpersonal factors. Access to participation in clinical research depends not only on the physical consideration and proximity to a site, but also on enabling the patient to feel supported, understood, and welcomed. And that's what you were just saying. If you speak a language that is culturally sensitive to the needs of, the Russian immigrant population and the Latinx population, you're welcoming them. You're making them feel understood. And I think that's such a crucial point.
Let me use that, Tisha, to ask one additional question. So, one thing that we've heard, even throughout our history, is this question about trust, and that is becoming ever more critical in the COVID-19 pandemic. Widespread vaccine hesitancy that's increasing, an inability to sort of differentiate information from misinformation. How do you build that trustworthiness and address the questions that are honestly, sort of born of trust in the community?
Yeah, that's a really important point. I think for us, when we started this process, we started it with focus groups to kind of understand the issue. And what we heard from more than 700 individuals was that Yale couldn't address it, that we would not be trusted no matter what we did or who we sent. And the only way to really overcome it was partnered with the community in this way. And so that's what we did. But when we went to even the group of individuals now who we have this incredible relationship with, and they're such advocates for clinical research broadly, not just at Yale, they were all skeptical and didn't want anything to do with it at the first meeting. And we joke about it now. But I think that what we did to break down those barriers, we started with education around what happens in a clinical trial when there is no diverse participation, with real numbers of trials and participants that had gone, drugs that had been approved by the FDA. We showed real examples of labeling indications and changes regarding safety and other things. And they became convinced that this was something that they should take on. And so as the community leaders had the information and they were equipped to address the issues, and we spoke very honestly about issues like Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks and what happened, but we went beyond the taglines and said, here's what regulatorily changed after those events, and here's why research continues to get better. And so now they understand all of those things. They are very passionate about it. It's all a part of the educational process to become an ambassador for them. And I think that really that knowledge is why we've been able to make a difference, how we've been able to overcome the trust. And I think, to be honest, it's a key to what we all need to be doing, because I think once there's a clear understanding of these issues, of the regulatory structures that are in place, the IRB, the data safety and monitoring boards, and other things, it's a renewed trust, but it has to be delivered by someone who is a trusted voice. And so I think that that's really the way that we all have to think about this. I know we want to be the trusted voice. We want to be the physician. We want to be the leadership to go in and say, hey, believe me, you can trust me. But without having that establishment, I think it's very difficult. So I'd say that's the most important piece.
Yeah, thank you. And that answers Jazz Gray's question as well in the question and answer. I think I'm conscious of the time and want to thank everyone for both of you and all the participants for weighing in today. You know, I think one of the things that we've heard is the importance of these long-term relationships of trustworthiness and listening, and of honesty, being clear about what we know and don't know, what we expect and can't expect, and listening carefully and answering to the best of our ability without overselling and without sort of pushing people in a way that they don't want to be pushed, and respecting their individuality, agency, and situation. So let me just thank everyone again and invite you in 2 weeks. We're going to talk again about workforce development, and we have a number of other activities, and refer you again to the document and our email, as I would love to hear from you. Thank you, Tisha. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you all, and have a good day.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.